land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their back confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand that pulls the string.
Well, good morning, Micro Effect and Connecting the Dots listeners. It's Tuesday morning, July 9th, 2019, and are going to be introducing a couple new guests to our radio show today. First, we've got Dr. Dennis Cuddy, and Dr. Cuddy is a professor of history. He's a very, very accomplished author. He has literally written 25 books exposing the nature of the deep state, the nature of the power elite, and how they are literally trying to destroy everything that we've got in this country that is good. And he is really a patriot who has been around a very long time and has done a tremendous amount of good. So with that, Dr. Cuddy, thank you for joining us this morning. And I want you to expose just exactly how deep the deep state is and how really, let's say, how many and how at the same time how few people are really controlling everything that happens in this country. Mark Hornke and Joe McNeil were just talking about the deep state and all the lies that make up the country today, and how little we can believe and how much is being concealed. And I want you to tell our listeners, you've been studying this for a very long time. I've read a number of your books and a lot of your articles, and believe me, I don't think there's anybody in the country has a better handle on the power elite and the deep state than you do. So with that, Dr. Cuddy, welcome to the radio program. Oh, it sounds like maybe Dennis is not on that. We'll make sure that he calls in and we get him on the line. So that in any case, the program that we're doing today is really to try to tie together what's happening in this country. And then in the second hour, we're going to have Michael Badnarik, who is really an interesting constitutional expert who ran for president. He was a Libertarian candidate for president in, I believe, 2004. And he is someone who has been really involved with teaching of the Constitution and tying all these things together. So I will try to get Dr. Cuddy on the line. Joe, go ahead and go to the music, and that'll give me a chance. Oh, he's here now. Okay, great. It sounds like Dr. Cuddy is on the line. Dr. Cuddy, I gave a introduction of you. You weren't here to hear it, but explaining that probably no one in the country has a better handle on the nature of the deep state and of the power elite than you, and that you've written so many books and done so much to expose that. Please tell our listeners, let's lead into this with you're telling our listeners exactly what you've been working on all these years and what you've discovered.
Well, this started, I guess, about 45 years ago, and I was in graduate school, and I always had a inquisitive nature. And when I was in graduate school, one of the reading assignments was on the muckrakers. They were sort of the investigative reporters around the year 1900, and so Lincoln Steffens and Ida Tarbell and some of those others. They would investigate things. In fact, one of them investigated what happens with sausage and how it's made. And Teddy Roosevelt was eating breakfast one day and eating some sausage and reading one of these articles that the investigative reporter had written, and he all of a sudden said, he spit his sausage out and said, "Never again am I eating that stuff." And he found out what all went into that. But anyway, one of the people was a Thomas Lawson, and he wasn't as big as Rockefeller, but he was almost. He was head of all the largest copper industry in the nation, just like Rockefeller was in charge of oil, J.P. Morgan banking, Andrew Carnegie Rails, and Vanderbilt and so forth. They used to call them they call them the robber barons, was a nickname they gave them, because they really weren't capitalists in the sense that most people believe in free enterprise capitalism. They were what I call monopoly capitalists. And in this, Lawson was just sort of matter-of-fact explaining. He wasn't criticizing, he was just saying this is the way things are. And he says what Rockefeller and Standard Oil people have is like a religion. He said that if you do what they say, you will be rewarded greatly with wealth. But if you don't do what they say, there's no place on earth that you can escape from their wrath. And he went on to say, and this is 1904, he went on to say that a Rockefeller agent is in every hamlet in the land. Not every big city, New York, Chicago, not every city, like Detroit or Kansas City, but every hamlet, every small, tiny little town, Rockefeller has his people. I said, I wonder. And so I started writing my first paper for graduate school and a class on this, sort of what came to be called conspiracy theory of history, that things don't just happen accidentally. There are powerful forces and people who have been around for hundreds of years. And so what I started was not methodically saying, okay, I'm going to start in the year 1600 and so forth and so on, but it was like a puzzle. You gather information a little here, a little there, a little here, a little there, and you start piecing this all together. And so my first real book, I'd written other books, but my first real book on the subject was called Now is the Dawning of the New Age, New World Order. It was in 1991. It actually came out before Pat Robertson's book called The New World Order, which Pat Robertson, of course, did not even write. He had a man named, I think his name was Jim Black, down in Texas, write it for him. And, of course, Pat left certain things out. Pat had attended the London School of Economics, so, of course, Pat did not include the role of the London School of Economics in this massive plan. The London School of Economics was built in 1895 by the Fabian socialists to train socialists to get into government and basically control the British government, which they did, along with another group I found. Some of it was I was on a show. I used to be on every Friday night with Dr. Stan Monteith, Radio Liberty. He's deceased now, but you can still find that online. I think some archived old shows and some information that they sell. And Dr. Stan was a brilliant man. He had been an orthopedic surgeon, but he traveled widely. And one of the places he practiced medicine was in South Africa, and he used to look up on this hill and see this little monument to Cecil Rhodes, and he started wondering about him. And so he came to England, and he wondered a little more, and then he wound up in his final practice out in California. But he was always looking for information, so he shared some of it with me. For example, Bill Clinton is a Rhodes Scholar, which are named for Cecil Rhodes, who's the big gold and diamond magnate in South Africa with strong ties to the British government. And so what happened was there was a professor named Carroll Quigley at Georgetown, and he wrote a huge book called Tragedy and Hope, and this is in the mid-1960s. And in this book, he said the tragedy was that the average person through democratic government was running things, and the hope was that we really needed these powerful people behind the scenes to manage the world's affairs because the public just didn't have the intelligence to do it. And so he really loved them. And so for a couple of years in the early 1960s, these people, the paraleaders I call them, followers of Cecil Rhodes, Lord Alfred Milner and some others, allowed him, Quigley, to look at what they called their secret records. And so my book in the mid-90s was called Secret Records Revealed. Dr. Stan had been watching Carroll Quigley and reading this book, and Carroll Quigley, along with a Catholic cardinal, Georgetown's a Jesuit institution, a Catholic cardinal named Avery Dulles. He was the son of John Foster Dulles, which ran the State Department in the 1950s under President Eisenhower. He and Quigley decided they wanted this young fellow. These people monitor young people, like, college age, to see who down the line might be useful to them. And they like people who often are narcissists. They're full of themselves. They think they're brilliant and so on. And they're possibly blackmailable. They're corruptible. Bill Clinton used to, smoke pot and all this sort of thing and womanize all over the place. So he was rather ideal. But they had to keep an eye on him. So when he took his side trip to Moscow as a Rhodes Scholar, a Father McSorley from Georgetown was there, just happened, quote unquote, to be there to watch for Bill because, Bill with women and so forth. So they groomed him and they planned and so forth. So he would eventually become president. But the secret society of the elect, as Cecil Rhodes called it, began formally in 1891, and he said it would last about 60 years as a conspiracy, and they would work with the Fabian socialists who were founded right after Karl Marx's death in the 1880s. And so they would work together to further this plan. And what was the plan? It was to have a world socialist government. And that plan began many, many years ago. The powerful people go back hundreds of years. For example, in the 1600s, you had King James I in England. He was the one for whom the King James Bible is known. And he lasted till about 1825. And then you had Charles I until about the mid-1840s. Then you had a revolution, Oliver Cromwell. Now, he was funded by Dutch. The Dutch seem like a small country today, but back then, very, very powerful, big money people, big money, lots of trade, global trade with the Orient and so on. And Oliver Cromwell, from the history books, he was called the Roundheads. They had a particular haircut that looked like he had a bowl on your head and trimmed around it. Well, he didn't do too well. He messed up, but he was funded by the Bank of Amsterdam. They were funding him to become head of this British government. Well, he messed up, so the Stuarts, as they were called, that's James I and Charles I, and after Cromwell is Charles II, followed by James II. They're of the Stuart dynasty, the Stuarts. So come 1688, James II was a Catholic. And the Protestants, of course, they didn't like that. And so they fomented a revolution in 1688. And the revolution occurred in 1689. And they overthrew the Stuarts, James II, and they brought back the Protestant heir to the British throne, who was named Mary. In the meantime, she had married William of Orange, of the Dutch, big, prominent house in Holland, the House of Orange. And so she married him, and they both came back to England and became king and queen, King William and Queen Mary. William and Mary, like the college is called William and Mary. And immediately, William granted a royal charter to the Bank of Amsterdam to establish the Bank of England. That's where the bank, very powerful today, Bank of England, started, with a grant of a royal charter to the Bank of Amsterdam. And so what did they do? Well, very quickly, in 3 years, they got the Bank of England into a huge amount of debt, because that's how they control individuals and entire nations. Like they're controlling us, we got, $23 trillion debt now. It's doubled and tripled and all in the last 2, 3, 4 years. And so on, with Barack Obama and so on. So you get a nation in debt, and you can control them. So this goes back many, many years. And what I would do is I would look at that, and then I would look at something that happened around the time of the Revolution. I would hear the name Illuminati, the Illuminati. And I'd heard the name Illuminati, but I said, okay, I'm going to dig into them. And so I have online a 9-part series on the Illuminati. You can look at it, newsreviews.com, or you can just Google my name, quote, Dennis Cuddy, close quote, and Illuminati. And you'll see a 9-part series, and I give all the names of who did what, when, and all that sort of stuff. And they were very interesting in and of themselves, because they infiltrated the Masonic lodges in France and actually fomented the French Revolution. That's where the French Revolution came from. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because somebody says, oh, there's old dead people, who cares? No. It is directly relevant to today, this very day, in recent times. Because when they infiltrated the Masonic lodges that fomented the French Revolution, their watchwords were liberté, égalité, fraternity. And they said, oh, that sounds nice. Sounds like our liberty and equality and brotherhood. Far from it. Liberté. By liberté, they meant license. Means do your own thing. Forget God. Just forget God. Do whatever you want. And to symbolize that, they put a prostitute on the altar of the Cathedral of Notre Dame. They were just rebelling against the French dynasties, the Bourbons, Louis the 15th and 16th, all the Louis. But they were rebelling against God. No God's going to tell me what to do. And so then the égalité, that didn't mean like we think of equal opportunity. They meant égalité, meaning leveling of the masses, all the masses. Everybody was known as citizen this and citizen that, make them equal sounding. But the real rulers were what we call the philosopher kings. That comes from Plato, Plato's works, way back. And they would be the brains, what we call the encyclopedists. They had encyclopedic knowledge. They sat around the salons of France telling each other how smart they were. Rousseau, Diderot, Montesquieu, Condorcet, Saint-Simon. These were like the leading lights, the intellectuals of the day. And so coming out of the French Revolution, you had a man named Saint-Simon, and his secretary was a young fellow in the early 1880s named Auguste Comte. And he developed a system of positive polity, not politics or policy, but polity. And what he called it was sort of a religion of humanity. Since we junked God, there's God's not going to tell us to do. Well, what kind of values will we have? Well, man will decide. Man will be God, sort of like Eve and Adam in the Garden of Eden. And so they developed a whole system of this. So by the late 1800s, it had entered into our law schools, where young Oliver Wendell Holmes and Felix Frankfurter and others, very famous jurists, would be imbued with this philosophy, so that by the early 20th century, early 1900s, when these fellows reached the U.S. Supreme Court, they were thoroughly developed in this philosophy, and they called it positivism. And what that meant was they would say, well, the Constitution means whatever I say it means. Who cares about the Founding Fathers, the original intent? We don't care. It means whatever I want it to mean. That's the philosophy coming out of the French Revolution. I'll do whatever I feel like morally, have abortions, have free sex, whatever. So they did the same thing with our law system. The Constitution means whatever I want it to mean. And so what we had then throughout the 20th century was a gradual shift legally away from the biblical founding principles of our country. The nation was founded really on biblical principles. James Madison is known as the father of the Constitution, and he actually incorporated a lot of the principles he had been taught in religion by Reverend Witherspoon. And, it's very, very much into our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence, talking about God, life, liberty, and so forth. And man is created, creation. You don't have abortions if, God is creating a child. That's before birth, right? So they had to junk all that stuff, and they started doing their own thing. And they would, that's where the doctrine in the early 20th centuries of separation of church and state came from. And, of course, they referred to Thomas Jefferson's famous letter, I think it was January 1st, to the Danbury, Connecticut Baptist Church. And he was explaining, he says, we have to have a separation of church and state. Well, he caught blazes for that. So what he did is, in his second inaugural address, he was elected twice to the presidency, elected in 1801 and then 1805, served to 1809. In his second inaugural address, he said, look, you guys got this all wrong. What I meant is that the federal government should keep its nose out of the affairs of the individuals and the states. And that's why, until 1838, the state of Massachusetts was actually funding, with tax dollars, the Congregationalist Church, the main church of Massachusetts. So obviously, this separation of church and state is a ruse. It's a fallacy that we have. But these guys, Felix Frankfurt and Oliver Wendell Holmes, started using that, especially the Everson decision in 1947. They said separation of church and state, get God out of the schools, get him out, like that. And so a lot of the decisions from then on were based on precedent. You started to have less and less emphasis on what's the original intent, what does the Constitution say, and they switched gradually over the 20th century to say, well, what's the precedent? What does precedent say we should do? And so these guys, these positives, started establishing their own precedents. And they were really radical sort of leftists. And that's why you would have, starting, in the 60s a little bit, then under Jimmy Carter, and by the time you got to Clinton and Obama, you had the courts being packed by those presidents with liberals who would nominate positivists who believed the Constitution meant whatever I wanted to mean, and into the Supreme Court. That's why you could have a decision like Roe versus Wade in 1973. And Roe versus Wade is nowhere in the Constitution. The right to abortion is nowhere in the Constitution. What Justice Blackmun said, who wrote that decision, he says, I've had a penumbra. That's what they call it. It's a fancy name for a vision. And he says, well, I know it's not in the Constitution, but I've had this vision. And the vision told me that it really should be in the Constitution. So, yes, women have a right to abortion. It's nowhere in the Constitution, but you got a right to abortion now. And so, this is how they work. And so that's why these values that are being rammed down children's throats, we call them secular humanism, in the schools, starting in the, around the 1950s or 60s, famous court cases. Torcaso versus Watkins actually declared secular humanism was a religion. This is in the early 60s. A lot of famous court cases battling liberals against the original intent conservatives. And that's why you would have a lot of political fights. It used to be that President Lincoln, a Republican, was known as the party of freeing the slaves. So in the South, you have a lot of Democrats. Democrats were right-wing, Ku Klux Klan, radical, right-wing, pro-Confederate conservatives originally. But then, when this started, you had a flip. And what happened was the Republicans were basically taken over by what I could call fiscal conservatives. They were de-emphasizing the social issues, and the liberal Democrats were emphasizing the social issues, like we needed busing, and we need to get prayer out of the schools, and we need to have abortion rights. So the parties just sort of flipped positions. But then when Ronald Reagan came along, he sort of tried to flip it back. He said, no. Look, Republicans stand for morality too, not just money. We're not all just about money. And so there was this massive outpouring of people, religious people, Baptists, Methodists, all, who had not been registered to vote. They thought politics was dirty, It was called in the 1880s of the pietist movement. We're pietists, and we don't want to have anything to do with dirty old politics. Well, they found out that dirty old politics was not going to leave them alone. It was telling them what they could do and not do with their children. Is ramming sex ed down the throats of children whose parents and the children were very, biblically oriented. And so there was a lot of organizing of parents groups all over the place. Of course, the hierarchy of the educational establishment came from this positivist tradition of John Dewey. John Dewey was a co-signer of the first Humanist Manifesto. Back in 1933, he took over Columbia University's Teachers College. By the mid-1950s, they were producing most of the superintendents and principals of the largest city school systems. And, of course, they would select teachers who followed in their footsteps. And so the NEA, largest union of education, National Education Association, became in lockstep with this leftist philosophy. Even though a lot of teachers themselves weren't that much leftist. So Ronald Reagan came along, and I joined that administration, and he said, no, we're interested in social issues too. We also are going to emphasize that there should not be abortions, that you should be able to say voluntary prayer in schools, and that forcible busing is not good for blacks or whites, either one. And I was brought to Washington. I was teaching at UNC Chapel Hill, and the main thing I was brought to Washington for was to correct that situation with busing. Nobody liked it. Blacks, whites, nobody liked forced busing. It was, just oppressive to everybody. And so I developed a solution. I called it predominant first choice and free transportation. And the noted African-American columnist for the Washington Post, William Raspberry, took my solution and promoted it. And it was tried out first in Norfolk, and black scores went up. Tried out later a variation of it in Oklahoma City, and black scores went up. That's why today you don't hear much at all about the issue of busing. And so I was also counseling the Solicitor General of the United States. His name was Rex Lee in the first Reagan administration, on what to do about things like school prayer. And so everybody was fighting. The left was saying separation of church and state, and the right wing was saying freedom of religion. And so they were going back and forth and back and forth. Nobody was getting anywhere. So I decided, I wrote a column in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which was the Pulitzer Publishing Company's newspaper, as well as USA Today. I said, look, instead of banging heads and getting nowhere, why don't you, on the right, the Reagan conservative, original, traditional constitutionalists, I said, look, what you have to do is confront the left, liberals, on their own terms, right? So in busing, I said, you guys, you liberals, you're discriminating against blacks. Well, they had a fit, and I proved it because when you bust, the court ordered busing, it was racial balance busing, and to racially balance the school, you have to bust the minority population in inverse proportion to the majority. So if a school system is, let's say, 90% white and 10% black, to have racial balance in each school, you have to bust 90% of the black youngsters, but only 10% of the white youngsters. They say, oh, yeah, I see. So I solved that problem. Then I did the same thing with school prayer. I said to the liberals, listen, you like freedom of speech. See, they could care less about freedom of religion. Liberals care. They don't care about that. The media, they don't care about that. But they do care about free speech. So I said, look at it this way. If Johnny can voluntarily say, thank you, teacher, then Johnny has to be able to say voluntarily, thank you, God. Or else you liberals are discriminating based on the content of the speech. And they said, well, yeah, okay, we see that. And so that's why you don't hear much about the controversy of free, school prayer today. So I solved that one, too. And then I was counseling them on the issue of abortion, and I won't go through the whole thing, but I had a letter to the editor in the May 19th, just a few weeks ago, Washington Post, explaining this. I said, listen, and I put this in the terms of the left. I talk to the left. It's no good just banging heads against those people. They're very stubborn, you don't get anywhere. So what I do is I use their arguments and I flip it on them. And so I said, listen, you leftist women, right? If you lose your perceived right to abortion, you know why you're going to lose it? They said, why? And I said, because of your support of Roe versus Wade. They said, what? That's ridiculous. But I proved it to them. I said, look, what Roe versus Wade, with its companion decision, Doe versus Bolton, says is that constitutional personhood is conferred at birth. That's what it says. It's birth. Everybody thinks it's a woman's right to choose. No, that's secondary. A woman can't come and kill me, bang, because I'm a constitutionally recognized person, right? So the main issue is, when is constitutional personhood conferred? And they, in Roe versus Wade, Blackman again, he can't think his weight out of a paper bag, I don't think, he's deceased now. He said, birth. And I said, all right, you leftists, do you have any intelligence? Oh, yes, we pride ourselves on our intelligence. So I said, okay, tell me this. What sense does it make to say that a prematurely born child at 5 months after conception is a constitutionally protected person is a birth, but an older child?
Dr. Cuddy, I hate to cut in, but we've got our commercial break coming up. Let's pick it up on the other side of the break. I really am fascinated with this. Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. And I want to mention the fact that we have a new sponsor on our program. It's called 7K Metals. And right now, the stock market is sitting at historic highs. But how much longer can this last? The 2008 banking crisis nearly brought down the whole financial system worldwide and only managed to kick the can down the road a few years by saddling average American taxpayers with trillions in additional debt. That was 11 years ago, and the national and personal debt levels are much worse today, pushing us to the point where the dollar is nearly worthless. Gold and silver have been true money for thousands of years and may be the only asset class left standing when the inevitable global financial collapse happens. You buy insurance for your car, home, and life to prepare for life's mishaps. Why not purchase some insurance for the inevitable world financial meltdown, especially if that insurance is better than money in the bank and available at wholesale prices? You can support our Connecting the Dots radio program and ensure your financial survival by joining me at www.danhappel.com and click on the 7K Metals icon to learn more about a program that could be the best financial insurance policy in America. This is a program much like Costco. It's a wholesale discount precious metals program. I urge our listeners, if you want to support Connecting the Dots, I urge our listeners to click on that site and learn more about the whole process. Dr. Cuddy, thank you for really good lead into what we've been talking about, the deep state and the power elite. And I've read a number of your books. You do an excellent job of connecting the dots. I know that you were talking about school prayer, about abortion, and a number of issues that are affecting our country. I would like to have you tell our listeners really about who the power elite are. I mean, you name names. You always are not a bit afraid to call the power elite what they are, but kind of names and talk about how they literally taken over the entire political class and much of the business class in this country.
Yeah, well, there's several aspects to that. A couple of examples of the who, and then we'll get into the how. And so forth. It would be David Rockefeller was one who recently died about a year or so ago, and they take over about 100 years ago media sources. J.P. Morgan was going to, a big banker, was going to buy up about 300 major newspapers, and they decided we don't need that. We'll just buy up the top 25 because the other, smaller town newspapers feed off of the information of the larger ones. And I actually put quotes of, who found out the money guy for Rockefeller's name was Sibley, and Oscar Callaway was a member of Congress, I believe it was 1917, where he put in the congressional record this letter that he had found, that described their plan, And so if you control the media, then you pretty well control everybody's source of information. And to give you an example, a couple of examples of how that works, David Rockefeller came out with his memoirs, which was titled Memoirs, a book, big, thick book, in 2002. And in there on page 405, at page 404, he says, it was a great day at the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations. He had been chairman for many years, I think from 1970 to 85, and then emeritus after that. He said, this is almost an exact quote off the top of my head. Some people believe me and my family are part of a secret cabal, that we're internationalists who are conspiring against the best interest of the United States in order to form a more integrated global political and economic structure, one world, if you will. And then his next statement is, if that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I'm proud of it. Now, I tried to find some major source, ABC, NBC, CBS, Washington Washington Post, New York Times, who actually mentioned that. Because whenever I asked or talked to people about it, they said, wow, that's a shocking quote by an important man. So you would think that would be newsworthy. But because they control the newspapers, they deliberately keep that stuff out of it. And you say, well, how do you know that? Well, when that book came out, Memoirs by David Rockefeller, the supposed conservative person on the New York Times opinion staff, David Brooks, review about it. And I got the book, I read it. Nowhere in that review of that book does he even mention this. Now, whether he left it out or whether I don't know, but the point is they deliberately keep things like that away from the public. Another example would be a very, very contentious era. It was a very peaceful time, the 1950s under Eisenhower, but one of the main controversies was McCarthy. Senator McCarthy was looking for communists, looking for communists. And the liberals, of course, poo-pooed. They said, oh, you're seeing a communist behind every bush. And, there's no communists all over the place. Well, later on, we found out through the Venona documents, they were released in the 1990s, that, McCarthy was right. And in fact, in the late 1980s, Carl Bernstein of Woodward and Bernstein fame wrote a book called Loyalties, A Son's Memoirs. And that book is based on his interview with his mother and father in the Washington, D.C. area. And the father says, Carl, I'm worried about this book you're going to write because you're going to say McCarthy was right. And the father says, McCarthy was right. We were communists. Remember the party? We were in the gun. We were all over the place. So McCarthy turns out to be actually right. Now, at that time, the Communist Chinese Revolution had just occurred in 1949, and Castro is going to come about in 1959. So there's this big push for communist revolutions all over the place. So when McCarthy's talking about communists all over the place, the liberals said he's ridiculous, he's drunk, he's an idiot, he doesn't know what he's talking about. So anyway, 1959, Castro comes to power in Cuba. And if you said, why, the New York Times is a bunch of leftist, fake news slanting things toward the communists, the intellectuals would say, that's ridiculous. You people are a bunch of nuts. You're a bunch of right-wing, stupid people, and so on. Well, turns out the foreign editor of the New York Times from 1951 to 1960 was named Herman Dinsmore. And Herman Dinsmore in the late 60s wrote a book called All the News That Fits. And he said, yeah, that's right. We were slanting everything towards the communists. So again, it turns out that the truth was being kept from the people. Now, another person today you might have heard of is George Soros. Very powerful people, a very, very powerful person. About 20 years ago, he literally brought the country of Malaysia to its knees because he's what's called an international investment banker. And he has trillions of dollars, not his own money, but people give it to him to invest, trillions of dollars at his disposal. And with just a click of a mouse, he can put $1 trillion into a country and take $1 trillion out. So he puts in a huge amount of money into Malaysia. Malaysia then bases its economy and hiring practices and all that on that, that level of economic activity. And then Malaysia didn't do what he wanted them to, so he yanked it out and almost, collapsed the economy of Malaysia. Now, to show you an example of how the allegiance is to these powerful people, George Soros and what happened was he's a little fellow during World War II, and the Nazis used to have him run errands, take messages here and there. George is told to take a message to these doctors in the town to get on these railroad cars because they're going to take a nice little trip, like that. Well, George's daddy says, George, don't tell those doctors to get on there. They're going to take them to Auschwitz or somewhere, and kill them. And so George didn't do it. He didn't do it. So in his autobiography, he's describing this, but after he says he didn't do it, he says, but I miss those good old days of running errands for the Nazis. In other words, his religion comes second. And he's also very anti-Israel. Now, you think, well, he's Jewish. How come he's anti-Israel? Because he's a globalist. The power leader are globalists. And Israel is a very strong nation, right? United States, so there's strong nations. He doesn't like strong nations. He's a globalist. He believes all of the activities should come under people like him, the big shots, who are wise and rich and all that, and they are the ones who should run things. Just like Quigley in his book, Tragedy and Hope. These people who came from, the Cecil Rhodes. And he foments other stuff behind the scenes, like the Arab Spring, where they overthrew the head of Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood took control. George Soros funded that through the Tides Foundation. He has these foundations he funds. And you may remember the names Bernadette Dorn, the Weathermen and Underground, and her buddy Bill Ayers, who were buddies of Barack Obama, killing a bunch of people in the 1970s. And so he funded their newsletter. Their newsletter, I think, it was several months. I think it was in the fall of the year. Said, hey, let's go to Egypt and have a revolution. So sure enough, by the January and February of the next year, they were having a revolution. Well, that effort was funded by George Soros. So these guys, stir things up. And the Power Elite in general has a philosophy of divide and conquer. So they will take a nation like Nigeria, and they'll form a nation which really shouldn't be a nation, because you have the Christians in the south, the Muslims in the north, the Igbos, I think, in the east, and Yoruba in the west. And so they keep them separate, at odds with each other. Same thing with Kuwait. There was no Kuwait until about 1920, and one of the powerful people under Cecil Rhodes' plan, Lord Milner did, his name was Sir Percy Cox. And around 1920 and 21, he literally created the nation of Kuwait. He sliced off the bottom of Iraq. Now, why did he do that? That would mean that Iraq would not have an outlet to the sea. So if they controlled this small nation of Kuwait, give them lots of money and all that sort of stuff, then Kuwait would do the bidding of the British, right? And so Iraq would have to bend and supply, oil and all that sort of stuff. They wouldn't have independence. They wouldn't. And you need to have independence for your national sovereignty. And so I actually correspond with one of these people of the Secret Society of the Elect. Cecil Rhodes started. His name was Arnold Toynbee. He was the leading world historian of the 20th century. And I didn't know it at the time, but my senior project in high school was to become Toynbee. And only later on did I find out that he had delivered a speech in Copenhagen in 1931 in which he said, look, we're trying to undermine national sovereignty because we want this world government. But if anybody finds out, if the press or somebody finds out, he said, quote, we will lie with our lips about that which we are trying to accomplish with all our might with our hands. In other words, they'll just lie, flat out lie. They don't mind lying. Why? It comes out of the French Revolution. Who cares about God? I want to do whatever I want to. Machiavelli said the ends justifies the means. He wrote that famous book called The Prince, who, talking about how politically you manipulate things. And so they have various ways of doing things, and like Dan mentioned, the deep state. The deep state is one thing. Now, a lot of people have written about the deep state. What I add to the deep state is it's like the British and the London School of Economics would train people to become the bureaucrats in the British government. So prime ministers, they come and they go and they come and they go, right? But the bureaucrats stay there. Well, in our country, we have a similar system, and that's how the deep state will operate. They would have people like when I was in the Reagan administration, there were a lot of President Carter's holdovers, his political people. He would change them at the last minute to civil servants, so they just blended into the bureaucracy, and their job was just to stay in there and protect what Jimmy Carter had done. Same thing with Donald Trump and Barack Obama. They convert them at the last minute. They stay in the bureaucracy. They smile at Donald Trump and the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, and head of transportation, whatever. They smile at them, but they're in there to protect the previous administration, like Carter or Obama. What they did, and you say, well, how do they do that? Well, the people are under the misconception that when Congress passes a law, that's what's enforced. No. It goes to the department, commerce, whatever the department, education, energy, whatever it is. And there, the bureaucrats, namely these people, are given that law, and they write the rules and regulations that enforce it. So the rules and regulations are going to be sure to maintain what Jimmy Carter or Barack Obama have done. And so that way they're very much like the British London School of Economics trained people. While presidents come and go here, these guys stay. They burrow deep into the bureaucracy with their particular philosophy of, radical leftist, let's have a socialist government. Why? Because hundreds of years ago, the plan was, through a dialectical process, when the U.S. became an independent nation, the power elite didn't like that. So they say, okay, we'll use the thesis, that's the free enterprise, American New Republic. They'll be the thesis, and we will create the opposite, the antithesis, that's the dialectical process. You create an opposite, so they created communism, right? And so the ultimate synthesis that's in the middle between the free enterprise capitalists and the communists will be socialism, world socialist government. But before you can have a world socialist government, each nation has to be made socialist first. And so they created Hitler because the word Nazi means national socialist. Each nation has to become socialist first. And that's why they moved us slowly that way. That's why when Barack Obama came in, he sort of nationalized General Motors and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and all that. That's moving toward socialism. At the other end, they're moving the communist Chinese toward the other end. They're moving towards free enterprise capitalism. So we are going to move towards socialism. The communist Chinese are moving towards socialism. They actually, in communist China, in the university, have a chair, a university chair, prominent position on free enterprise. So they're learning free enterprise capitalism as we are cramming communism and socialism down the throats of the kids here. And in case you don't believe that, when I was teaching at UNC in Chapel Hill, there was a survey taken. And the survey found that 29% of the students said some professor had tried to persuade them in the wonders of socialism or Marxist communism. And I remember teaching one time, some students came up to the front of the class when I was, presenting a controversial subject in history, and they said, "We really thank you." I said, "For what?" They said, "For being even-handed, not trying to ram some sort of radical left ideology down our throats, because our previous economics professor tried to do just that." And so they're burrowing into the colleges. Parents have a lot of say about what goes on in the public schools, K through 12, but colleges, if you want to see political correctness, forget the legislature and Congress. You go to a university campus. That will show you real political correctness. Unless you are a leftist, you're going to have a really, really hard time getting a permanent faculty position. And I found that out myself. That's why in 1982, the last time I taught was the second summer session, and I got a call in August to come up to Washington, and that's when I went up to join the Reagan administration, where I thought I could do some things, and I did. I accomplished a lot of things.
Well, Dr. Cuddy, you have done a lot of wonderful things. There's no question. And the biggest thing that I think you've done is to connect the dots for a lot of listeners and a lot of readers through your books. And I want to give you a chance. I know, you do have so many books out there. I want to give you a chance before we run out of time to be able to talk about how to order your book, get your books, where they're available, and then also I know that you've got your mother is going through some health issues, and that you wanted to let our listeners know if they're interested in trying to help her with that financial situation. How that can happen. So go ahead.
Okay.
Use this last few minutes to talk about that.
Okay. I try not only to do historical, I write columns on news with views about how I was surveilled. The government surveilled me. I predict terrorist attacks. I have a better record than the FBI and CIA had predicted that. I have an article called Drone Wars. That's on News with Views. I'm trying to get a movie. I have an article on News with Views called Society of the Elect, the movie. I'm going to try to get that done, too. But as you said, the hospital messed my mother up, and I'm going to do a TV interview showing this scandal with Medicare and how they treat older people in the very near future. But if you would go to YouTube, and just type Peggy Cuddy, C-U-D-D-Y, you'll see how she looked when the hospital got through with her. She was almost in a coma. She had just gone in for a urinary tract infection, and it's been tremendously devastating, just devastating. And so I would encourage people to look at Matthew chapter 25, just the last 3 verses, and let your heart speak to you, because this has cost me over $31,000 a year. They haven't messed her up. She can't walk anymore. My life savings about gone. And if you could look at Matthew 25, verse 44 through 46, the last three verses. And if you can help in any way, you can tell Dan, or I can give you my address, or however you want to do it.
Okay, very good. Now, we do have a few minutes left before we go to the end of the hour. I just want to thank you for agreeing to be our guest. You're always it's fascinating hearing all the things that you know and having you help connect the dots for us on this radio program.
Thank you.
I tell our listeners and I tell our guests on this show, I really like to be a minimal part of the discussion, because the people that I have on are so much more interesting and fascinating than I am. And the reason I've got them on, because they're experts at what they talk about. And that certainly is the case with you. I hope you will consider continuing to be in the future, because we've only started to scratch the surface of really what information you have available. Would you tell our listeners a little bit about some of the books that you've written?
Sure.
And then I know a lot of them are available on Amazon, but that way you can, our listeners can really learn a lot more about you and about what you're talking about.
Oh, okay, sure. Amazon would be the best way to get the cheapest price. News with Views, as I mentioned before, where I have articles, they also offer some for sale. I've written books on other subjects, immigration and so on, and edited them. But in this general area I've been talking about, the first one was that 1991 book where George H.W. Bush has been starting to talk about the New World Order, and the New Age movement was very prominent. So I did a long history, so like 400 pages or so, trying to detail all the information I could. Then Secret Records Revealed came out, and I've already mentioned that, about Cecil Rhodes and his people and this plan to, as he said, take the government of the whole world, was using Rhodes Scholars and others to do that. And there was so much information that I did a sequel to that called The Globalists, which has twice as much new information as the Secret Records Revealed. And then we entered a period where you had a lot of catastrophes like 9/11. I have one book called September 11th, Prior Knowledge. Then I did a sequel to that called Cover Up. And then as we move forward, I decided to give a broad look at socialism, because that was the ultimate goal. So I'd have a book called The Road to Socialism and the New World Order. And then I did sort of a larger sequel to that, which was just called The New World Order, The Rise of Techno-Feudalism. Because what they're doing is they're returning us to the old feudal days, you know, with the dukes and the earls and the knights and all that, where you didn't have a middle class. You had the elite at the top, and then you had the peasants. So they're returning us to that. There's an attack with all these taxes and the inflation and so forth, and debt that we're getting into that's really hurting the middle class most of all. And so that was another book by that title. Then I said, well, let's look at some key things, key issues over the years. So that one was called The Power Elite, Their History and Future. It has a sort of light yellow design. And I cover there the Oklahoma City bombing, what really happened, the Illuminati, what they really did, you know, things like that in that book. And then I did a book called The Power Elite and the Secret Nazi Plan, which I think I mentioned in our last program, because whether you believe it or not, there's a secret Nazi plan that was hatched right after the beginning of World War II, and it's coming to fulfillment today. People think the Nazis were defeated. They were militarily, but the secret plan is coming to fulfillment now. It's a massive plan, an ingenious plan. It's evil, but you need to watch for it. You need to watch out for it. You know, it's only about 160 pages. It details that. And then the latest one is called Conspiracy. And on the front of that, I have Cecil Rhodes and elements of the conspiracy. I have a sequel to that coming along, but they're not printing it until there are more sales of the first volume. So those are the main books to look for.
Okay, well, Dr. Cuddy, we're moving into the top of the hour. I want to thank you for being our guest, and I look forward to the next time you come on a radio program. And incidentally, we wish the very best for you and your mother especially. And
please help
we'll
us.
Be saying some.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is The Micro Effect. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their backs confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand that pulls strings. It makes it
Welcome to the second hour, and today we've broken the program into two programs, really. The first hour being Dr. Dennis Cuddy explaining exactly who the power elite and the deep state are. And on the second hour, I have the great pleasure of having as our guest Michael Badnarik. And Michael was the Libertarian Candidate for President in, I believe, 2000. I know you've done this, been involved with the Libertarian Party for a long time, but he is a constitutional scholar of the highest order, and he's done more to really make Americans aware of exactly what we're losing in this country if we let our country go. Let the power elite take hold. Let them destroy the fundamental liberties that are embedded in our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, our original Bill of Rights, and really what the Founding Fathers envisioned for this country. With that, Michael, welcome to the program, and maybe give our listeners a little bit of information. Let's say amplify a little bit on your background and how you got so involved with this the whole issue of teaching constitutional studies.
Well, thank you for having me on the program this morning. I appreciate that. I was lucky enough to have a computer programming job for the electric utility in Chicago, and they saw fit to send me to Pennsylvania for a year and a half to work on a rather large computer project. While I was there, my company paid for my apartment, for my food. Basically I had a lot of per diem money coming in on top of my, salary. And so for a short period of time, I literally had more money than I knew what to do with. And then suddenly the IRS came in and decided if you are on temporary location for more than 12 months, it is no longer temporary location. And literally overnight, I had a significant tax liability that I had previously been unaware of. So it was a really unpleasant experience with the IRS, and I started to study the IRS, the 16th Amendment, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, And I had a really strange thing happen. As I studied the Constitution, it came to my attention that most of what the government does is unconstitutional. And I just said that couldn't possibly be right. There were no protests, there's no picketing, people were not outraged. Everybody's going around their, ordinary daily business as if nothing was wrong. And so I discredited my own conclusion and continued to do so until someone gave me a book called The Creature from Jekyll Island, and it was written by our friend G. Edward Griffin. And as I read that book, I realized that, yes, I was wrong. The problem is much more profound than I originally thought it would be. Most of what the government does is unconstitutional, and they are consciously and deliberately violating our rights on every, chance they can. Now, the reason the American public is so content with that is that Americans have no idea what the Constitution says. After running for president, I gave many, many speeches, and I would ask the audience to raise their hand if they are good, patriotic Americans. And no big surprise, it's unanimous. Everybody considers themselves patriotic. Everybody considers themselves a good citizen. And then I would ask, raise your hand if you can tell me how many articles are in the Constitution. And sadly, it was unanimous again, but it's because nobody was raising their hand.
Yeah, that's exactly how it works. The power elite, the people who are running this country, learned long ago that the best way to dumb down average Americans is keep them so busy trying to make enough money and raise families and do all the things that are important for a society. Keep them so busy that they don't have time or they don't have the interest in learning more about their own government. And certainly television's been a huge part of that. We need to be visually entertained. We are becoming very, very lazy in the way we approach the world. And intellectually, we've lost an awful lot in the last, 40 years especially. Michael, talk a little bit, if you would, about what the vision of this country really was and why it is so important that we be participants in self-governance.
Well, King George was presumed to own everything. He owned all of England. He owned pieces of land mass around the world. It used to be said that the sun never sets on the English Empire. And the king had all of the rights because he had all the property, and the king would grant privileges to his subjects. And so eventually there was a large migration to the North American continent, and we started out as proud citizens or proud subjects of King George. But Benjamin Franklin indicated there is a difference between revolution and rebellion. Franklin defined revolution as an astronomical term. When the Earth revolves around the sun, it comes back to its original starting point. We originally started out as hunters and gatherers, subject to no one. And over the course of time, we invented somehow this concept of the divine right of kings, where they gave us the rules and we just followed them. So, according to Benjamin Franklin, the time period between 1760 and 1775, this 15-year period, was the American Revolution, when Americans changed the way that they thought. In 1760, We were proud subjects of the king, hail to King George. And 15 years later, not so much. We had thrown tea into the harbor, and we decided that we didn't like being subjected to someone else's decisions. And so eventually, 1776, we wrote the Declaration of Independence. We told King George, thank you very much, but we're not going to play your game anymore, and we are going to become free, sovereign, and independent state. And the general idea was that in England, the people did what the king wanted, what the government wanted. And in the United 13 colonies, the government was going to work for the people. This was a complete flip-flop to the way the source of power had already been assumed for most of human history.
Okay, and then I know that part of the problem was that the colonies were not given proper representation in the English Parliament, and that was one of the real big sticking points. The fact that the English people in England, in Great Britain, and even in Scotland and parts of Ireland had parliamentary representation, but the colonies really didn't, and they felt were being really left out of the whole process of being able to, have representative government of any form. Is that perception correct?
It is. You need to really study history to understand what was going on. It's not just a list of dates and people. I mean, there are human people with personalities and motivations to do things. And it makes it much easier to understand why we are in the position we are now when you understand what people did and why they did it at the time. In the time that we declared our independence, King George was fighting wars against France and Spain. And fighting one war is difficult. Fighting two wars on opposite fronts is even more difficult. And because the colonies were perceived to be a part of England, the colonies were being taxed and drained of natural resources. In order to build ships, you need a mast. And many of the trees in the American colonies were tall and straight and strong. And so not only were we sending tax money to England, but we were, cutting down these grand, magnificent trees and shipping them to England so that they can make more ships. And from the colonies' point of view, a lot of their money and a lot of their resources were going to the king, but they didn't see any personal effect of that. They were paying for the war, but they didn't feel that they were being defended because of that war effort. And so finally they said, look, we're not going to pay for something we're not getting. And that was a strong reason to secede from England. And I use that word explicitly because there are, different colonies, different counties in California that are planning to secede from California. Hawaii is planning to not be part of the United States. And being a man from Texas, I strongly support Texas secession. I feel that Texas would be far better off without the burden of the federal government looking over it. And so, when I talk about Texas secession, people think, Michael, you're crazy. The Civil War proved that secession is illegal. And when they say that, I say, well, have you ever heard of the Declaration of Independence? They go, well, yes, of course. And I go, do you like the Declaration of Independence? They go, well, yeah, one of the finest documents written by man. I said, are you aware that the Declaration of Independence is a secession document? The only difference between the American Revolution and what is inaccurately known as the Civil War, is that we basically won the first war and lost the second one. So if you believe that it was the 13 colonies were perfectly justified for leaving England and starting their own country, then explain to me, please, how you can claim that the southern states had no such authority to leave the Union and form their own country. It's basically a contradiction in terms. It's a double standard and doesn't work like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad you're bringing up the issue of secession, because people always talk about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, but really the Declaration of Independence was the document that set the stage for the others. And I think people don't realize how important the Declaration of Independence really is and was at the time. And so I'm glad you're bringing this subject up, because this is something that doesn't get a lot of attention. And the fact is, with the people trying to reform the idea of the Electoral College, to take away the Electoral College and to create one man, one vote, whether they be illegal or otherwise, that whole process is designed for really for control by the masses. It's as the term's used quite a bit, it's mob rule. And that was never the intention of what our founding fathers envisioned, and that was the reason they put the Electoral College in place, was to protect the rights of all these so-called, the power elite call them flyover states. Maybe amplify on that a little bit, if you would.
Sadly, most people have never gotten a significant education on anything, especially our civic duties and stuff. And when I was running for president, I was involved in a radio interview. And during my introduction, I casually mentioned that the United States is not a democracy. When we started to take phone calls from the audience, the first woman who called was apoplectic. You could almost visualize her shaking as she held the phone to her ear. And she said, "Mr. Badnarik, you're an idiot. You're not qualified to be presidential candidate because you don't even know that the United States is a democracy." And my response was simply, "I pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic for which it stands." At which point she promptly hung up the phone and didn't want to debate me anymore. Article 4 of the Constitution explicitly states that the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government. So what's the difference between a democracy and a republic? Can you have elected representatives? Yes. Can they vote for things for you? Yeah. Well, the difference is that in a democracy, we can vote on anything. We can vote on the color of your living room. We can vote on whether or not you get to keep and bear arms. We can even vote on whether or not your religion is one of the approved religions in the United States. So in a democracy, the majority wins and the minority loses. In a republic, there are certain things that nobody can vote on. We can't vote on your, freedom of religion. We can't vote on your freedom of speech. You don't have freedom of speech because everybody allows you to do that and agrees with you. You have freedom of speech because, dissent is what, started this country. We dissented with King George. We don't like the way you're doing it. We're going to start another country. So hypothetically, if the United States government is doing something that we don't like, if we're going to fix it, somebody's going to have to stand on a soapbox and say, hey, 23,000 gun laws are unconstitutional. Are you with me? Hey, the IRS is, taking way too many taxes from us. Are you with me? So if we're going to fix a problem, the only way to start fixing it is to talk about it. And our freedom of religion is not there so that you could cheer for your favorite football team. Freedom of religion is there specifically for freedom of political speech. And Americans have, forgotten what dissent is all about.
Yeah, they have. And, when we talk about this, often overlooked is the fact of rule of law, which is what our republic is founded on, is based on the idea that we need to protect the rights of every individual. And the fact is the minorities are the individuals that are the most affected by being a republic. If we take away the idea of a republic form of government and go to mob rule democracy, what we're doing in effect is taking away all the rights of all the minorities that are part of the system. And when we do, we're destroying the very thing that so many of these so-called liberals talk about, which is the rights of the minorities. Well, guess what? The systems that they are promoting are based on communism. They're based on something that takes away all rights.
I agree. And we live in an ideological war. There's a war going on right now. And that is a war of ideas and a war of words. And most of us are losing that battle, one, because we're unaware that there is a war going on, and two, because we're functionally illiterate and we don't know how to challenge these insane ideas that are being expressed, on the mainstream media and adopted by all the people who are incapable of critical thinking. So one of the ideas is the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, that phrase comes directly from the Communist Manifesto, and, it basically implies that there is a collective happiness and that we could just turn this knob and increase, the greater good for the greatest number of people. Well, in order to do that, you have to sacrifice the minorities for the greater good of the majority. And there used to be a sci-fi television program where, this mechanical robotic society was taking control over everybody, and, you were going to become assimilated. And the expression on the program was, resistance is futile. You will be assimilated. And it was assimilated into this Borg, creature where everybody was exactly identical to everybody else. There was no individuality. Well, fortunately, that's only a science fiction thing, because I can stand here and say, resistance is not futile, it's mandatory. Resistance to this megalithon in Washington is mandatory if you are going to maintain your individual rights. Everybody is different. I applaud diversity. I think that everybody has something to offer, but it is explicitly because everybody is an individual that makes this worthwhile. And I know so many people who, they're going to, be politically correct because they want to be an individual with everybody else doing exactly the same thing.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me that so many of these young people are so concerned about being individuals, and yet at the same time, everything they do is promoting this sort of commonality and collectivist way of looking at life. So it's maybe the Achilles heel, though, of the radical left is the fact that our young people are, by their very nature, as American youth especially, they tend to rebel against, authority. And that's been the case as long as I've been alive. I was one of those kids that my very nature, anybody would tell me I had to do something, I'd do the exact opposite. But the problem that we've got now today is that the academia and the controlled media are feeding these young people this brainwashing technique, and we need to figure out a way to break into that cycle and introduce these young people to the idea that to be free, you have to be an individualist. To be free, you have to be a republic and not a democracy.
Well, and they have to understand that there is a difference. Unfortunately, anybody who watches mainstream media, they use the word democracy so often, everybody just assumes that we are a democracy, and the Founding Fathers loathed a democracy. They considered it a tyranny of the majority, as you said earlier, and that, the government does not have the authority to just pass a law and force everybody to live within its idea of utopia. It's not going to happen. I'd like to share a quote from H.L. Mencken. He wrote this in 1923, so it's a few years before my time. And he said, "The fact is that the average man's love of liberty is 9/10 imaginary, exactly like his love of sense, justice, and truth. He is not actually happy when free. He is uncomfortable, a bit alarmed, and intolerably lonely. Liberty is not a thing for the great masses of men. It is the exclusive possession of a small and disreputable minority, like knowledge, courage, and honor. It takes a special sort of man to understand and enjoy liberty, and he is usually an outlaw in democratic society."
Boy, that's fascinating. I hadn't heard that quote, that direct quote before. That is fascinating because it's true. The average citizen is much more comfortable with being just part of the collective, part of not standing out. They don't want to stand out. Cognitive dissonance is not only part of our culture, it is our culture.
And it is due in part, I tell people that we don't have constitutional problems, we have psychological problems, philosophical problems across the United States. There's a university in California, Stanford University, which has been famous for doing various psychological experiments, one of which was the Milgram experiment, where they had college boys half acting as inmates, the other half acting as prison guards. And the 1 week experiment had to be canceled after about 3 days because there was just so much real violence going on in this pretend environment. But what is even more fascinating to me is an experiment where a person was invited to be part of the experiment. They were led into a room full of people, and they immediately assumed that they were just one of 50 people participating in the experiment. Well, the truth of the matter is the other 49 people were the experiment, and you were the only person being tested. And they would do something really simple, like start at the beginning of the front of the room and say, "How much is 2 plus 2?" And everybody would say 5. And they said 2 plus 2, 5, 2 plus 2, 5, and they come to you. An amazing percentage of people said 2 plus 2 is 5 rather than contradict the audience that they were in.
Isn't that amazing? Well, let's pick this up on the other side of the break. It sounds like the 12 monkeys theory is quite a bit.
Serving the planet. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and my guest in the second hour is former presidential candidate and author, lecturer, Michael Badnarik. And Michael, before we get into the second half hour of this program, I just need to remind our listeners, we have a new sponsor called 7K Metals, and if you really want to support Connecting the Dots as a radio program, we need your support by asking you to go to our website at danhappel.com and click on the 7K Metals icon to learn more about a program that could be the best financial insurance policy in America. 7K Metals is a group who function much like Costco or Sam's Club. They are a subscription wholesale precious metals company. And if you sign up with them, we do have a very direct benefit out of that. So I ask our listeners, please try to find out more about the program. There's no obligation. All you need to do is go to my website, which all of our radio shows are archived on that, .com, and click on the 7K Metals icon. Anyway, with that, Michael, thank you. We were having a discussion about how important breaking out of the matrix is. And, of course, you were at the Red Pill Expo in Hartford about a month ago. I was there as well. In fact, that's where we met and talked about being on the radio show. And we're living in a matrix right now. Whether we want to realize it or not, we are in a controlled media, controlled academia, controlled government matrix. And it's time that we start to wake up and break out of that matrix. And that's what you're talking about doing. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Yeah, people have difficulty believing that the American government is complicit in any of these wrongdoings. I mean, other countries, China can kill people, Nazi Germany killed people, but, oh my gosh, we are Americans. Our flag is red, white, and blue. Our government would never do anything that despicable. It's ludicrous and dangerous to think that way. People are people. There are good people and bad people in any subset of the population you want to pick. So to assume that everybody in our government is doing things, legitimately, that's naive. Now, I'm not suggesting that the United States government is necessarily as bad as some of the other ones, but anytime people want you to do something that is not in your best interest, they typically lie. So, if I'm in the swimming pool, freezing my butt off, and you're getting ready to jump into the water, I'm likely to say, "Come on in, Dan, the water's fine. It's warm. It's almost like bath water." And so what I've done to you is I've given you a misinformation about the environment. You jump into the pool and go, "You SOB, this water is freezing cold." But, that's just kind of a minor hypothesis of what the government is really doing. The IRS is not really part of the federal government. The Federal Reserve System is currently not. The Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5, gives Congress the authority to coin money. It does not give Congress the authority to print money, and even if Congress did have the authority to print money, they don't have the authority to transfer that power to somebody else. If I go through the police academy and the city or the county give me a uniform, a badge, and a gun, I am allowed to direct traffic and write traffic tickets. I can't give you my gun and my badge and say, "Dan, would you mind writing a few traffic tickets for me? I'm going to take a long lunch." I am not authorized as a police officer to give you my gun. So Congress has no authority to give the Federal Reserve System, which is a private organization, the authority to counterfeit our money. If you and I hang out together and we start printing $20 bills on my special laser printer, we can watch a movie, have a couple beers, and then once we get about $10,000 in phony money printed up, we can hire a limo, go out and get, surf and turf. We could be living large. What's going to happen when the government finds out that you and I are living off of this phony money? Well, you and I are going to go to jail for a long time. That is called counterfeiting. The Congress has a responsibility. 186, Congress is responsible for identifying and punishing counterfeiting. But no, back in 1913, they unconstitutionally authorized the Federal Reserve to print money out of thin air. The Federal Reserve has been counterfeiting our money since 1913, over 100 years, and it is that counterfeiting that has caused inflation. That counterfeiting is the reason that our economy sucks, and it is the fact that Congress did that unconstitutionally over 100 years ago, and Americans still don't know the difference. That is why our country is going to hell in a handbasket. I won't take monopoly money because it's worthless. I won't take your grandpappy's Confederate money because that war is over and that money is worthless. And for the same reason, I do not accept Federal Reserve notes for the second book I wrote because, it's not worth anything. Now, I do have to use it to pay my rent because my apartment complex isn't smart enough to know the difference between Federal Reserve notes and monopoly money. But as soon as people start to realize that the money is worthless, that's when we're going to have some serious problems. The food will be taken off the grocery shelves. And if you don't have food stored up and you don't have, guns and ammunition to protect your food, that's when you're going to become a victim of the Second American Revolution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's important that our listeners understand, and I think most of them do, we've got a kind of a select group. They're pretty tuned in on things, but the fact is the Federal Reserve is not federal. It's a private banking consortium or cartel of private bankers. It is obviously that means it's not federal, and they have no reserves. They literally print money out of thin air, and our Treasury has become accomplice to this because they are the printing press for the Federal Reserve, who are allowed to loan every dollar into existence at interest. So in other words, we've turned our entire financial system over to a private banking cartel that they can charge us interest on something that costs them virtually nothing to produce. And that's where the crime, that's where the process of counterfeiting comes in. And it also, I have to say, that's the reason that our federal government is involved in this whole scam, because it means that they can create an unlimited amount of money that they can borrow, and they can do that without having to ask the taxpayers to pay all the taxes that make that happen. And as a result, we've got $22.5, almost $23 trillion in debt that is immediate debt, and another $130 trillion in unfunded liabilities. And people have got to wake up to the reality. There ain't no such thing as free money. This money that is being produced right now, we are on the hook for it. Every single penny of it, we are on the hook for. Isn't that right, Michael?
Well, I would flat out disagree with that because the debt is fraudulent. If I send you a letter saying, Dan, you owe me $10,000, write a check and mail it to me before the end of the month. Okay, I've written you a letter, I've demanded money, but there's no justification for that debt. And you would be perfectly, justified in saying, and the horse you rode in on. Let me explain that during Ronald Reagan's presidency, he commissioned a report called the Grace Commission Report, and the Grace Commission proved that none of the money, 0% of the money that's collected by the IRS on April 15th goes for roads and bridges and hospitals, and all of it goes for paying off a small percent of the interest on the national debt. So let me ask you and your listeners a rhetorical question, because I don't expect you to come up with an answer. If the Federal Reserve can print money out of thin air, why does the government have to collect your money in April? Why don't they just print more money? I mean, that's what they were doing anyway. And so, I don't know about you, but it points to me that, the income tax is totally fraudulent. The government doesn't need or want your money. They can print more money if they need it. Okay? The reason that they have you fill out all these forms and mail in your 1040 form, signed, by penalty of perjury, is because they want your compliance. They want you to demonstrate that you are willing to do whatever the government tells you to do. So if I tell you to get down on all fours and bark like a dog, do I really care what breed of animal you're impersonating? No. I just want to watch you do something stupid, knowing that you did it because you were afraid of me. Nobody fills out their tax form in April because they love the government and they think that, wow, we are really providing for new roads and bridges. Everybody fills out the tax form because they're terrified of the government and they don't want to go to jail. Oh my gosh. So, if you're going to fill out your 1040 form, also get down on all fours and bark like a dog.
Well, Michael, I have to say your point is well taken. It's because of the compliant attitude of average Americans that this whole scam has been allowed to happen. And in reality, you're right. We don't have an obligation to agree with anything that is patently unconstitutional. But the problem is we've got to get Americans to stand up for their right to be to object to these kind of crazy laws.
Well, we suffer from the yeah, but phenomenon. I mean, you have your radio program. I used to have one. I've run for president. I teach my Constitution classes. And people will say, yeah, Michael, you're right, but... And then they come up with some excuse why they are afraid to do it. It's like, yeah, but I have children, or yeah, but, I'm just too lazy. Yeah, but I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. And I'm like, well, I'm so sorry. Well, then just do it. The very first press conference that I had as a presidential candidate, the very first question at that press conference was, Mr. Badnarik, what is your position on mandatory vaccinations? Well, it was my first press conference. I hadn't become a diplomat yet. I hadn't learned how to answer the question honestly without, pissing people off. And so the problem with engineers is that under moments of stress, we just blurt out the truth. And so my response to mandatory vaccinations was, you bring the syringe, I'll bring my 45, and we'll see who makes a bigger hole. And they said, well, Michael, aren't you being violent? And I go, no, I'm trying to prevent violence. And I said, this is a lethal injection. It is like, well, no, it's not. No, it's not. Well, how am I supposed to know? I'm supposed to roll up my sleeve and let you stick a needle in my arm and as I lay dying on the floor because of your lethal injection, then I'm supposed to shake my finger at you and say, oh my gosh, you lied to me? No. This is my body. I decide what food I eat. I decide what liquids I drink. And I decide if and when anybody sticks a needle in my arm. So I am
that's also
resisting
why the
violence.
pharmaceutical industry lobbied Congress to pass a law that doesn't allow people to sue the pharmaceutical companies for various vaccinations that cause all kinds of problems. It's they know that there's a lot of things in these vaccinations that are bad, and frankly, they've made Congress compliant to that whole scheme.
Again, we have a declaration of independence, and people don't know how to be independent anymore. They are reliant on the government for, housing and subsidizing their child's education. Everybody claims that the government is too big and too expensive, but nobody wants to give up the private benefits that they get. It depends on whose ox is being gored. And, people don't know how to think for themselves. That's why they're watching Fox News and CNN. We just listen to what the mainstream media tells us, and we just assume that BS that they're broadcasting is the truth, and we just kind of go along. And if you have people who are incapable of thinking for themselves, that's the reason that there is such a wide division about Donald Trump. People either love that man and want to build a statue to him, want to engrave his face, on the side of the mountain there in North Dakota, or they want to burn him at the stake because he's a witch. He's a witch. He turns me into a newt. It's ridiculous that the political diatribe that goes on these days is not political discussion. There is no logic. There is no intellectual debate there at all. Everybody is just saying all sorts of BS, and they believe it sincerely. I don't doubt that these people think that it's true, but there were a lot of people who thought the world was flat also, and all of them were wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right on. And I always like to remind our listeners that virtually every president after Ronald Reagan have signed on to the program called UN Agenda 21 or UN Agenda 2030. Virtually every president, in fact, every president has signed on to that program as supporting it. And one of the basic tenets of that program, and they're very specific about it, is that the world's population needs to be reduced to fewer than 1 billion people to be sustainable. And these presidents have signed on to that, knowing full well what's in that document. Tells me that they know full well that we've got to reduce the world's population by 92%, and that includes the United States of America. Boy, these people are pure evil. There's no question about it.
Yeah, I invite your listeners to look up the Georgia Guidestones, and it's 5 monoliths. They look a little bit like the stones in England, and they are encrypted with, or not encrypted, they are engraved with the explicit instructions that you talk about to reduce the population. There are currently 7 billion people on the earth, and they want to reduce it to 500 million. So according to the Georgia Guidestones, we are going to eliminate, we're going to kill 13 out of 14 people in order to make the world sustainable, apparently. So I don't know if you think you're going to be the one person out of 14 who's not killed, but I have lots and lots of ammunition to make sure that I am not dead prematurely.
Well, and even if we are dead prematurely, Michael, I'd rather, as George Washington was famous for saying, I'd rather die on my feet than live on my knees.
Absolutely. I'm from Texas. We have the Alamo, where 189 men died for the right to own property, knowing that it was pretty much a suicidal mission, but they never gave up. With their last breath, they were willing to fight for what was right. And that just doesn't exist in American society anymore. You know, we're a bunch of sissies. In fact, many parents with school-aged children are, currently battling with a crisis in bullying. And, I mean, we had bullies when I went to school. We just didn't have as many sissies. If you're going to go home and hide in the closet because somebody called you a name, let's grow up. Put on your big boy pants and, it's like, grow a pair. And so...
Well, no, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. You're exactly right. That's part of the process of growing up and being a man, is learning at some point that if somebody beats the crap out of you, after it happens a couple of times, you've got two choices. You turn into a wimp, or you stand up and take care of that guy that's pushing you around. And those of us with a pair tend to stand up and beat the crap out of somebody trying to do that to you.
Right. And when I was at Red Pill out in Connecticut, I had several people come up to me, and they're all just amazed. I ran for President of the United States, and they're going, "Oh, Mr. Badnarik, you're so special. I wish I could be like you." And my response was, well, then be like me. Stop being a wuss. You're amazed that I'm willing to stand up for my rights and reject all this, nonsense, laws passed by, various governments. You can be brave. Stand up and be brave. There's no paperwork that you have to fill out. So everybody thinks I am so wonderful because I don't let anybody push me around. It's like, well, you can do the same thing. Stop letting people push you around.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You're right on that. Michael, we've run out of time. I want to thank you for being on the show. Very quickly, tell our listeners how they can learn more about you and stay with you.
My website is constitutionpreservation.org. constitutionpreservation.org. First thing that I recommend is go to the bottom of the page and sign up for my newsletter. I don't submit a newsletter very often. It's very sporadic, only when I get a burr under my saddle and I have to complain about something. But I also have written 3 books, which are available on my website. And if you're tricky and you know how to use the internet, you can find my phone number and you can actually call me. And I'm willing to answer questions. I'm not willing to sit on the phone for an hour and a half and listen to you complain about all the things that are wrong in your life. So ask your question and then, move on.
Okay, well, thank you again for being our guest. I hope you'll consider coming back. This has been a fascinating discussion, and obviously we just broached the surface here. We've got a long way to go to educate America and help them to connect the dots. I want to thank our listeners for tuning in. Michael, I want to thank you for being our guest on this program, and I ask our listeners, please join us again next week and let us help you to connect the dots.